Hello, and thank you for joining me for this presentation today. My name is Jane Nodder, and I'm a PhD candidate on the Technology Enhanced Learning and e-Research programme at Lancaster University. And I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to present my research to you today. My research is looking at the personal and professional development needs of online educators, expansive learning and collective agency in a change laboratory intervention. This presentation is a follow-up to the presentation that I gave at this conference in 2020. My research aims to understand those factors that influence the professional development needs of online educators at different stages in their careers. I'm also looking to add new knowledge for the change laboratory research methodology to the existing literature. When I presented at the conference last year, my ideas for my research were still at the very early stages. But now I've completed my data gathering and my change laboratory intervention. And today I'd like to present some initial findings and my thoughts going forward from my detailed data analysis. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the background to my research. So the idea came around even before the pandemic started. At that stage, many educators in UK higher education institutions were shifting their teaching from campus locations to the online teaching and learning classroom. The expectations around this transition are for it to be seamless, and yet educators often receive very little by way of professional development before they start to teach online or as their careers progress. Where professional development is provided, it tends to favour technology and instructional design over online pedagogy and creating online teaching presence. And this can mean that educators can feel very unprepared to transition from the campus to the online classroom, giving rise to tensions and concerns. Some examples of these could be lack of tools and solutions for assessing and meeting professional development needs, little or no involvement of educators themselves in identifying those factors that drive their professional development needs, sporadic and often quite formal professional development input, and no real sense of a learning community or of cross-institutional collaboration when it comes to professional development needs. So I wanted to explore this topic to see whether I could find some solutions and some ways forward to address the tensions and concerns that educators were feeling. I also wanted to explore the change laboratory as an appropriate methodology for looking at these questions. And I wanted to see how possible it was to adapt the change laboratory to fully synchronous online delivery. So my research is underpinned by a theoretical framework that goes by the name of CHAT, or Cultural Historical Activity Theory, which is a branch of activity theory itself. CHAT explores the complexity of human activity in activity systems, where an activity system is defined as a unit of human activity. So this could, for example, be a group of online educators in an UK higher education institution. CHAT offers a lens for understanding the interactions, the relationships, and the tensions that take place in these activity systems, using a set of concepts and tools that include things like the expansive learning cycle, double stimulation, and the activity systems model. CHAT allows for participants in research to look back over the history that's given rise to tensions and concerns in their systems, and allows them to think about that in the current day situation and to plan forward for the future. It offers a very systematic and systemic approach. And CHAT also provides a framework for the researcher to interpret and analyse real-world data sets. So from this perspective, it offered me a very useful theoretical framework for my research. And then my research methodology, as I've already mentioned, was the change laboratory. And the change laboratory is grounded in CHAT as its theoretical framework. So the laboratory is an interventionist methodology where participants work with a researcher interventionist, that was me, in a protected space to look at the issues in their activity systems, particularly the tensions and concerns that they're facing. They use the CHAT concepts that I just mentioned around expansive learning, double stimulation, and activity systems models, plus a suite of change laboratory tools themselves to look at these issues. The outcomes of a change laboratory are not predetermined, they're formed by the participants. So the researcher interventionist offers the participants a series of tasks that they can undertake in their change laboratory, but it's the participants who guide the process and who determine the outcomes. As such, the laboratory allows participants to build collective agency to really analyze the current tensions and conflicts in their activity systems and to think about how they might change culture and working practices. And so over time, the change laboratory can bring the theory of chat and the practice of the change laboratory looking at the activity system together. So how did my change laboratory happen? Well, I recruited 14 online educators from 9 UK higher education institutions, and these ranged from institutions in the north of Scotland right down to the south of England. The online educators who took part in my research were at a range of career stages and experience. So I had people who had been teaching in the online environment only for quite a long period of time, people who had pivoted online as a result of the COVID pandemic, and people who had been working in a hybrid of blended learning between online and campus education. The educators took part in 9 sessions of 2 hours for the Change Laboratory, plus 2 review sessions over a 7-month period from November 2020 to May 2021. And all the sessions were delivered fully synchronously online. As I mentioned previously, the educators undertook a series of tasks to examine the topic of professional development for themselves. And as we went through the Change Laboratory, I was engaged in analysing the data to design the subsequent sessions in the Change Laboratory intervention. I've now had a chance to look at my initial findings, which fall into 2 potential areas. One is applying theory to practice and what we've actually learned about using chat and the Change Laboratory to carry out tele-research. And the second finding is very much around what we've learned about the professional development of online educators themselves. So to have a brief look at applying theory to practice to start with, what I've identified is that researchers working in technology enhanced learning can certainly translate theoretical concepts and frameworks, such as those offered by chat, into practical interventions to generate solutions for real world concerns. So in my research, the concepts, the language, and the tools in chat and the Change Laboratory underpinned the entire research process from conceptualization through study design, data collection, data analysis, and ultimately dissemination of the research findings. And the practitioners used the same concepts, language, and tools to question and analyze the social and cultural context that frames their activity. I also found that the application of theory and the use of this language and concepts and tools could help the participants to develop sufficient collective agency to really bring about change in culture and practice. And as a result of running the Change Laboratory over 7 months, I identified with the participants plenty of new methodological knowledge for adapting the lab for synchronous online delivery. And this will offer a workable option for TEL researchers to intervene with geographically dispersed practitioners across a number of activity systems. It simply wouldn't have been possible to undertake this change lab across the geography that we used it in had we have had to gather people together physically in a physical space. Moving on then to what we identified about the personal and professional development of online educators, there were probably 9 main themes that are coming out of the initial data analysis. First of all, the development of online educators covers both personal development and professional development. The educators in the study very much saw the personal development as being what is intrinsically driving them personally and what they want to achieve. Whereas they saw the professional development a little bit more about what they need to do to be successful in their roles. Now, clearly these two are very heavily intertwined, but they did make a degree of distinction between the two. We also identified that no one model of professional development fits everybody. The focus is very individual. And so as a result, frameworks and some of the models that have been developed in the past are not really directly applicable to each individual. And that may be because these frameworks have often been developed without any particular input from online educators themselves. We identified that there was no real ethos or forums for online educators to come together to discuss their personal and professional development. And often there was little institutional support for the professional development of online educators beyond what you have to do, which is normally around getting the technology to work. The educators also thought it was really important to get the student perspective in terms of what do students expect their educators to undertake in terms of the professional development in order to deliver online education effectively. We spent quite a lot of time in the lab looking at professional identity and the actual nature of the online educator's role and how it might vary from educating on a campus. So the educators were keen to think about which identity was primary for them. What did they see themselves as online educators first? Or did they see themselves as discipline specialists or as practitioner academics or just as jacks of all trades? So this was a really important area for them, and there's quite a lot of information in my data about identity. There was also a theme running through the Change Laboratory around online education still potentially being perceived as second best at this point in time. And then we looked at a couple of issues relating how to identify professional and personal development needs and how to meet these needs. So in terms of identifying, we looked at options for mapping and how to map needs or how to model needs. We looked at the use of frameworks and whether frameworks had anything to offer in terms of ways of identifying personal and professional development needs. And we also looked at how educators might understand institutional expectations around what is needed with regard to their professional development. In terms of meeting the needs, the educators felt that collaboration was absolutely key, that they needed to work with other people in order to progress their personal and professional development needs, and that this had been particularly difficult to do during the period of the pandemic. They also thought it was very important to have a structured approach to meeting needs and maybe also to develop something like a resource bank where educators could gather together material that could help them to develop their teaching and learning online, and also something like a sandbox where they could meet together to try things out before doing things live online with students. And as I mentioned just now, collaboration was seen as key to expanding learning, to sharing resources, to reducing isolation, and to connecting across institutions. So those are some of the initial findings around the use of theory in Intel research and the initial findings around the topic itself of personal and professional development for online educators. So where am I going next? Well, next I need to undertake a complete full data analysis. And so I've been trying to think about the storylines that might underpin that. And at the moment, I'm progressing my thinking down 3 lines of potential investigation. And still to kind of refine this a little bit further. My first storyline is about how the Change Laboratory intervention facilitated the development of expansive learning and collective agency in regard to the personal and professional development of online educators in UK HEIs. So this is very much about adding to the literature and the knowledge around expansive learning and collective agency and how it can actually happen. So the sorts of questions I want to address here are shown on this slide. How did the Change Laboratory participants use the theory of expansive learning? What is the evidence for the development of collective agency in my data? What is the evidence for the development of individual agency? What did we actually learn about the process of expansive learning itself? And to what extent did we actually achieve expansive learning in this Change Laboratory? And then what new understanding do we have about the tensions and challenges in the activity systems that we were exploring? My second storyline is about the new knowledge that this intervention can contribute to the use of chat and the Change Laboratory in technology enhanced learning research, and in particular in the online research environment. So how did the chat concepts, tools, and language help me as the researcher interventionist to design and deliver the Change Laboratory intervention? And also to consider the context in which technology is being used and to understand the tensions in the practitioners' activity systems. And then how did chat tools, concepts, and language allow the practitioners to participate in the change laboratory and to understand the tensions in their activity systems? Then thirdly, how was the change laboratory adapted for the synchronous online research environment? What worked well? What worked less well? And in this area, I'm actually in contact with other people who are currently carrying out change laboratory interventions online. So we're trying to pool our data and find out what we have in common and where the differences might be. And this will contribute to the literature on the use of the change laboratory online and provide new methodological knowledge for TEL researchers and any other researchers who want to use the change laboratory in the online environment. And then my third storyline, which is possibly the least well developed at the moment, is a series of questions for me as a researcher interventionist. What is the real change that has occurred as a result of this change laboratory intervention? What is different now that wasn't there before before I started this work? And as the researcher interventionist, what have I learned with the participants in the change laboratory? What differences might I have initiated? And how do I get evidence of the changes that maybe have come about? And then thirdly, there's a question of longevity. When, if ever, can we talk about durable changes from change laboratory interventions? Do we need to go back and look at the change laboratory again in a year's time and see where things have changed or moved on? And a bit more about that in a minute. So the way that I'm approaching my data analysis is twofold. Firstly, I want to look at agency and action. So I plan to analyze expansive and non-expansive learning actions in my data and look for examples that will answer the questions that I've just been exploring with you. I want to analyze where there was deviation from the tasks that I suggested as a researcher investigator to really explore the dynamics of the expansive learning process and how the participants took that and owned it as we went through the change laboratory intervention. And I want to plot this data against the expansive learning cycle defined by Engstrom in 2001 and the different stages to see how the change laboratory evolved over time in terms of expansive learning. And secondly, I want to look at agency and discourse. So I want to analyze the speaking terms in the change laboratory to look for discursive expressions of collective agency and plot those against a model from Hapasari, Engstrom and Carrozio, which looks at the expression of transformative agency and how you can identify that in the speaking terms and the discourse within the change laboratory. So this is my thinking at the moment as how I'm going to look at the data. So finally, where am I now? Well, I'm about to go through the data analysis, as I just mentioned. My change laboratory participants are very keen to continue to meet together and to take forward this topic of personal and professional development outside of the research phase of the project. And so we're really excited to see how that's going to develop and how they're going to maybe take forward the change laboratory and continue to adapt it to meet their needs. So I'd like to leave the final word with them, the change laboratory practitioners. I asked them in the very last session to sum up in one word how they'd found their change laboratory experience. And this is what words that they came up with. So they had validating, enlightening, enjoyable, collaborative, thought-provoking, fascinating, developmental, supportive, inspiring, reflective, interesting, and confidence building. And for me, as a researcher interventionist, this feels like a really positive step forward for the group that I've been working with. I've added some references for the presentation that I've just shared with you today, and I would like to thank you very much indeed for being here, and I hope that you found this of interest to you. Thank you very much.